I was 9 years old the first time my mother-in-law decided who I was. She hadn't met me yet. She was looking at a photograph my husband had texted her, the two of us at a hockey game in Ottawa, me laughing at something he'd said, his arm around my shoulders. And she called him that same evening and told him I looked like trouble. He told me this 3 weeks into our relationship, laughing about it like it was a quirky detail. I didn't laugh. Something in me recognized that sound. I had heard it before, in different voices, in different rooms, and I knew what it meant. It meant that no matter what I did, I had already been written. My name is Serena Kovac. I'm 31 years old, and I grew up in Kingston, Ontario, in a house where everything looked fine from the outside. My parents were together. We went to church at Christmas. We had a dog named after a hockey player. But inside that house, I was always somehow the problem. Too loud, too stubborn, too much opinion for a girl who hadn't earned the right to have one yet. I left at 18 for university in Toronto, and I never really moved back. I built a version of myself that those years hadn't touched, or at least hadn't touched visibly. I got a degree in occupational therapy. I found work I believed in. I made friends who didn't require me to shrink before entering a room. And then I met Theo's mother, and the whole machinery started up again like it had never stopped. His name was Theo Ashford, 34 years old, structural engineer, originally from a small town outside Guelph. We met at a mutual friend's dinner party in a condo in the annex on a February night so cold the windows had fogged over from the inside. He was standing near the bookshelf arguing gently with someone about whether Mordecai Richler was overrated, and I walked over and said I thought the question itself was overrated, and he turned and looked at me, like I had said something genuinely interesting. That was the beginning of everything. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. The proposal happened on a Saturday afternoon at the end of October, on a trail in Algonquin Park, where we had gone for what he told me was a last-chance weekend before the snow came. The trees had dropped most of their leaves. The light was thin and golden, and came in sideways through the birches. He stopped on the trail and turned to me and pulled the ring from his jacket pocket, his grandmother's, a small oval sapphire set in white gold, and he said my name once, just once, and then seemed to forget the rest of whatever he had planned to say. So he just asked. Quietly, like it was the most natural question in the world. I said yes before he got the whole sentence out. We set the wedding for the following August, a venue outside Elora, beside the gorge, on a Saturday evening. Dinner, dancing, the works. Something I had never let myself picture too specifically, because picturing things too specifically had always felt dangerous, like wanting something out loud was enough to jinx it. His mother's name was Sandra Ashford. She lived in the same town outside Guelph she had grown up in the house where Theo had grown up, and she had strong opinions about most things and shared them freely. In the beginning, I tried. I brought wine when we visited. I asked about her garden. I remembered which of her friends had the bad hip and asked after her by name. I was doing the thing I had always done, performing acceptability, making myself legible in someone else's language, hoping eventually the effort would register as worthiness. It never did. There was always something. I used the wrong fork at Easter dinner. I had laughed too loudly at a story her brother told. I had a job that required I sometimes work evenings and weekends, which she mentioned once, as though this was a character flaw she was generously overlooking. Theo would sigh and say she was just old-fashioned, that it wasn't personal, that she was like this with everyone. I believed him longer than I should have. 11 days before our wedding, I found out how wrong I had been. Theo called me on a Thursday afternoon while I was between client appointments. I could hear it in his voice immediately. That careful stillness, like he was carrying something he didn't know how to set down. He told me his mother had called him that morning. She had told him that she had information about my past she felt he deserved to know before the wedding. She told him that during my time at university in Toronto, I had been in a serious relationship with a man who had ended it because I had stolen money from him. A significant amount. She said she had spoken to someone who knew me then, a woman who had been in my program, and this woman had confirmed it. My mother-in-law used the word embezzlement, she said, and Theo repeated this quietly, like he was handing me something sharp. She's not who she's pretending to be. She never has been. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the clinic, and I felt the specific vertigo of a world that has just decided to tip sideways. Not because the accusation had any truth in it. It didn't. There was no stolen money. There was no criminal behavior. There was a man, yes, a man I had dated in second year named Derek, and there had been a fight at the end of our relationship that had gotten ugly in the way that endings sometimes do. He had said things. I had said things. I had borrowed $200 from him once when my student loan was late hitting my account, and I had paid it back the following week with an e-transfer he had confirmed receiving. That was the whole of it. That was the foundation on which my mother-in-law had constructed a story about embezzlement and deception to tell my fiancé 11 days before our wedding. I need you to understand something about why I didn't see this coming the way I should have. When you grow up being told that your version of events is always slightly wrong, you develop a habit of second-guessing your own read on things. You tell yourself you're probably overreacting. You extend benefit of the doubt past the point where benefit of the doubt makes any sense, because the alternative, accepting that someone is deliberately targeting you, feels too large and too ugly to sit with. I had done this with Sandra for 2 years. I had told myself she was difficult, not malicious. That there was a difference. There wasn't. I drove to Theo's apartment that night, and I sat down at his kitchen table, and I told him everything about Derek. The loan, the repayment, the e-transfer, the way the relationship had ended, and the things that had been said. I told him I had no criminal record, no civil suit filed against me, nothing, and that he was welcome to Google my name, check court records, call my references, do whatever he needed to do to verify what I was telling him. I laid it out plainly. Not defensively, because I was not defending myself against something real. I was just telling him the truth. Theo listened. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I know." I looked at him. He said he had not fully believed his mother when she called. That he knew me. That he had spent 2 years watching me with people, watching the kind of person I was in small, unremarkable moments, and nothing she had described matched anything he had ever seen. But he had called me because he felt I deserved to know what had been said. He was not asking me to prove anything. He was telling me so that I wouldn't be blindsided if it came up again. That was the man I was marrying. But we both understood the problem hadn't gone away. It was sitting in the room with us, invisible and patient, the way these things are. Sandra had calculated, whether consciously or not, that doubt planted close enough to a wedding has a half-life that outlasts any single conversation. You can say you believe someone. You can mean it. And the question still finds you in quiet moments, when you're tired, when something small goes wrong. She had known that. I think she had been counting on it. What she had not counted on was Petra. Petra Novak was 36 years old and had been my closest friend since our first week of university, when we ended up in the same 8 a.m. seminar on health systems and bonded over how little either of us wanted to be awake. She was Czech-Canadian, dry-humored, a physiotherapist in Mississauga with a memory like a court reporter and a zero-tolerance policy for people who behaved badly and then pretended they hadn't. She was one of the very few people I had told about the Derek situation when it happened, in detail in real time, over bad coffee in the university food court, because she had been there. She had also apparently been paying attention in ways I hadn't known. The engagement party was Theo's family's idea. His aunt had offered to host it at her home in Guelph 3 weekends before the wedding. A garden party, a chance for both sides to gather and celebrate before the August date arrived. I had agreed to it. I had tried to be gracious about it. Sandra would be there, and I had not yet figured out how to address what she had done, and I was operating on a thin and cautious kind of hope that maybe it would just sit underneath the surface long enough for us to get through the ceremony. That hope lasted until about 20 minutes into the party. The yard was lovely, I'll say that. Theo's aunt had strung lights through the cedar hedge and set out round tables with potted geraniums, and the late July afternoon was doing its best. Warm without being punishing, a faint breeze off the fields to the west. My parents were there, standing near the drink table, doing the strained performance of people who have never quite known what to do at social gatherings they didn't organize. Theo's colleagues. A few of my friends, including Petra, who had driven from Mississauga with a bottle of Ontarian sparkling wine and arrived looking like someone who had a plan. Sandra was at the center table, holding court in a beige linen blazer, performing the warm and generous future mother-in-law for an audience of people who had no reason to see through it yet. She had kissed my cheek when I arrived and said I looked beautiful, and I had smiled and said thank you. And the whole exchange had felt like two people playing chess and pretending to play checkers. At some point near 6 in the evening, I became aware that she was telling a story. She was at the center table with Theo's aunt and 2 of her friends from town, and her voice had dropped to that particular register. Not quite a whisper, but designed to carry selectively. I caught fragments. The words financial issues, something about patterns that don't change. A small, regretful sigh that was doing a lot of work. I felt my hands go still around my glass, and then Petra was beside me. She had been across the yard. She had, apparently, been watching Sandra the way she watched anyone she considered a structural problem, and she had caught enough of what was being said to understand what was happening. She said my name quietly, touched my arm, and said, "Can we step inside for a minute?" We went into the kitchen. She placed her bag on the counter and took out a folder, actual paper, actual folder, the kind of person Petra is, and she spread it out in front of me. Inside was a printed copy of an e-transfer confirmation. The original transaction from my account to Derek's, dated 11 days after the withdrawal. The memo line read, loan repayment as discussed. There was a timestamp, a transaction reference number, and Derek's full name. Petra had asked me to forward it to her when the whole situation had happened, years ago, because Petra believed in documentation the way some people believe in prayer. She had kept it. She had kept it in a folder, on her computer for 9 years, and when I had called her 2 weeks ago in tears from a parking lot to tell her what Sandra had said, she had gone and found it and printed it. Beneath the transfer confirmation were 2 more documents. One was a screenshot of a text message exchange between Petra and the woman Sandra had claimed to speak to. A woman named April who had been in our program and who had, in the screenshot, told Petra explicitly that she had never spoken to Sandra Ashford about me, that no one had called her, that she had no idea where this story had come from, but that if someone was using her name to spread it, she wanted that on record. The second document was April's written statement, a paragraph she had typed up and sent to Petra as a follow-up, dated 4 days ago, confirming the same thing in plain language. Sandra had not spoken to anyone who knew me. She had invented a source. She had built the story out of a detail she must have picked up somewhere over 2 years of Sunday dinners. That I had dated someone in university named Derek, and she had constructed a lie specific enough to sound credible and vague enough to be hard to disprove. She had done it 11 days before my wedding. I stood in Theo's aunt's kitchen with those papers in my hands, and I felt something settle in me that had been moving for a long time. Not anger, exactly, though there was anger in it. It was more like the particular, exhausting relief of finally being able to stop arguing with your own perception, of holding something solid that said, "You were right, you were not imagining it. This is what it actually was." I walked back outside. Theo was near the drink table talking to his brother, and he looked up when he saw my face and came toward me without being asked, the way he always did, reading me accurately before I said a word. I told him quietly what Petra had found. He looked at the documents for a long moment. Then he looked up at me. He said, "Okay, how do you want to do this?" That was the man I was marrying. We walked to the center table together. Sandra was mid-sentence, her hands moving with that particular animation she had when she felt she was performing well. She stopped when she saw us. Something moved across her face. Not guilt, exactly, more like recalculation. I set the folder on the table in front of her. Not loudly, not with ceremony. I just placed it there, the way you place something that belongs to someone. I told her and I told the table what the documents contained. The e-transfer confirmation, the text exchange with April. April's written statement, I said Sandra's name. I said what she had told Theo 11 days ago. I said clearly that the source she had claimed to speak with confirmed she had never spoken to her, and that the transaction she had implied was criminal, was a $200 loan repaid within a fortnight. I did not raise my voice. I had spent too many years being loud in empty rooms to waste the quiet I had finally learned. Sandra looked at the tablecloth. Her friends from town were very still. Theo's aunt's expression moved through several things in quick succession and landed somewhere resolute. The yard had gone quiet enough that the lights in the hedge were suddenly very noticeable, the way beautiful things become more visible when everything else stops. I told Sandra that she was not going to be at the wedding. Not because I was punishing her, but because I was done extending invitations to people who used them as opportunities to cause harm. I said I hoped, sincerely, that she and Theo could find their way to something workable over time, but that required her to stop doing what she had been doing, and I was no longer willing to wait around hoping she would choose to. Then I stopped talking, because I had said what I needed to say, and I didn't need to say more than that. Sandra left the party 20 minutes later with the 2 friends from town. She didn't say anything on the way out. Theo's aunt caught my eye as they walked through the gate and gave me a small, unmistakable nod. Theo's brother, who had been standing near enough to hear everything, exhaled and said, finally under his breath, in a way that told me this was not the first time Sandra had done something like this to someone. Petra stood beside me as the card gradually found its way back to conversation and movement. She put her arm around my shoulders and said nothing, because she has always been better at knowing when nothing is the right thing to say. The rest of the engagement party was, and I mean this without irony, genuinely lovely. Someone put music on. My parents relaxed, which they almost never do at parties. Theo's aunt brought out a butter tart tray, and there was a small, good-natured argument about which bakery in Guelph made the best ones. Theo danced badly with his cousin near the cedar hedge, and I stood watching him and felt something I don't have a single word for. Like relief and gratitude pressed together into something that had its own weight. We got married 3 weeks later on a Saturday evening in Elora. The gorge was gold in the late light. My dress had pockets, which I maintain is one of the better decisions I made that entire year. Theo cried during his vows, stopped, apologized for crying, and then cried again, and I laughed until I also cried, and our officiant gave us both a moment to collect ourselves with the particular grace of someone who has seen this before and finds it endearing rather than inconvenient. Sandra was not there. I had expected to feel something complicated about that. I mostly just felt the absence of a specific kind of tension I had been carrying for 2 years, and the absence felt clean. Petra sat in the second row. She had worn a green dress and had brought tissues in her actual hand because she knew me, and she handed me one at exactly the moment I needed it during Theo's second attempt at his vows, and I thought, this is what it looks like to be known by someone who sees you, clearly, and chooses to stay anyway. I have been Serena Ashford for almost a year now. Sandra and Theo have had 2 phone calls that I know of, both brief, both initiated by him, both careful. Whether they find their way to something better eventually, I genuinely don't know. That is between them and it belongs to them. My part of it is finished. What I know is this. There is a particular kind of person who decides who you are before you've had a chance to be anything. They build a story about you that serves them, that makes your presence in someone else's life feel like a threat that needs managing. And they tend their story quietly and persistently, the way you tend something you intend to grow. And for a long time, if you grew up being told your version of things was always slightly off, you let them. You extend the benefit of the doubt one more time. You tell yourself it isn't personal. You make yourself a little smaller at the table and hope that eventually the smallness will be enough. It won't be. It never is. The story just gets bigger. The only thing that stopped Sandra's story was documentation and a friend who had kept it a receipt for 9 years, because she believed, even then, that the truth was worth storing carefully against the day someone tried to overwrite it. I am Serena Ashford. I am 31 years old. I grew up in Kingston in a house where being too much of anything was treated as a problem to be corrected. I am still too much of several things, and I have stopped apologizing for any of them. I married a man who has never once asked me to be less than I am. I have a friend who drove to Guelph with a printed folder and stood beside me in a kitchen and helped me hold my own ground. If you have ever sat across from someone who rewrote your history so confidently you started to doubt your own, I want you to know that confidence is not the same as accuracy. And I want you to know that sometimes the truth has been sitting in a folder on someone's computer for 9 years, waiting patiently for the moment it's needed most.